Welcome back. Hi again. Glad you're here. We left off last time with the concept that an action potential is all or nothing, and nothing influences how intense that action potential is. It goes or it doesn't go. So the question was, why do we feel things differently? Why does a bright light hurt and a dim light doesn't? And we're going to address that now. And the answer to that question is all about frequency. It's the frequency of an action potential. So let's imagine that. Good color for this. Imagine that we have a weak stimulus. We have a weak stimulus here, kind of similar to our plots before. And this little line I've put up here at the top, that's 30 millivolts, because remember that we go from -70 up to 30, and that indicates, that indicates an action potential. Sorry, my FaceTime went off again. Apparently it's gonna keep going off. I might have to pause for just a second. Sorry about that. My nephew really wants to talk to his cousin. Okay, so real world, right? Where were we? We were talking about an action potential and a weak stimulus. So we have a weak stimulus. If we go from -70 up to 30, then we have an action potential. And what on the x-axis? So the bottom is time. How much time passes. So we have our weak stimulus, and our weak stimulus produces an action potential. And maybe over this period of time, it produces 2 action potentials. Cool. All right. Now let's crank things up a bit. Let's say that we have a moderate stimulus. So it's not necessarily what we would call a strong stimulus, but it's not a weak stimulus either. So it's stronger than the one that I colored in gray. And so over the exact same time period, this stronger stimulus, maybe it would produce 4 action potentials. Okay, and I know my drawings aren't exact. It's the concept. So maybe we would get 4 action potentials from a moderately strong stimulus. Now let's crank it up some more, and let's go. We've got a strong stimulus. And once again, it's just a drawing. So here's our -70, here's our 30, and we've got our strong stimulus here. And what's going to happen if we get a strong stimulus is the frequency of our action potentials is going to increase. So we get an increase in frequency. So stimulus strength directly relates to the frequency of action potentials. So this is something that students really sort of struggle with, is they want this to get bigger. They want an increase in amplitude. But the action potential strength doesn't change. It's how many you get in the same amount of time, and that's frequency. How frequently does something happen? So you get an increase in frequency of action potentials, and that is directly proportional to the stimulus strength. Okay. Other things that influence an action potential is the diameter of the axon. So if this is the axon, apparently I'm still writing in yellow. So there's our axon. And I've just been drawing it as this very one-dimensional thing, right? But remember, this is a cell. This is a tube. The axon is actually a tube. And so if we took that tube, imagine that you have a piece of PVC pipe or whatever kind of pipe you're familiar with, and you're looking at it from the side, like you're looking at this, my pencil, looking at it from the side. And then we turn it, and we look down the middle of it. So if we take an axon and we turn it and we look down the middle of it, what we're looking at is the diameter. So the diameter is, how big is it this way? So if we have an increase in diameter, what we also have is an increase in surface area. So you've got a smaller diameter axon on the left, and what I've drawn in there on all those little reds and greens is those are representing those channels. So we have sodium channels and we have potassium channels. But we can only fit so many sodium and potassium channels in a smaller diameter axon. Whereas if we increase the diameter, we've also increased the surface area. And so you can get more movement. You can pack more of those channels into the membrane. So that means that the sodium can move in faster, and you can have quicker conduction of that action potential down the length of that neuron. So larger diameter axons, larger diameter neurons are faster. Okay, myelination. So that's what this image is representing. If you may remember the Schwann cells, so this little thing, this is a whole cell. Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, so this would be a cell. Whereas in the central nervous system, this would be a process from an oligodendrocyte. Okay, and these form the myelin sheath. Okay, myelinated axons conduct impulses faster. Okay, and so, I mean, this hopefully makes sense. If you have an insulated anything, it doesn't lose whatever it is. Okay, so if you have an insulated handle on a pan, you're cooking, you can grab that handle, no problem, take it over to the sink, dump whatever you're cooking into the strainer, and you don't burn your hand. But if you don't have an insulated handle, then you grab that, you're going to burn your hand. It's not insulated. It's losing heat through that handle. Okay, same thing with neurons. This insulation keeps the neurons from leaking ions. So they're not leaking ions anywhere they're insulated. And so we have this myelin sheath along the length of the axon. And so it only has to open sodium channels at the nodes of Ranvier. Remember, those little spaces are the nodes of Ranvier. These spaces. So we're opening sodium channels there. So we don't have to go pop, 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 pop. Like, imagine that I set up a table in front of our imaginary classroom, and I put 10 soda cans, and I said, okay, you guys are on a team. One team member has to open every single soda can, and they get to the end, and you're gonna compete. Okay, and your team, you have to open every single soda can. You have to open all 10. But the other team, they open 2, and then they have a space, and then they open 2, and then they have a space, and then they open 2, and they have a space. Who's gonna go faster? The people who only have to open 6 soda cans. So it's kind of similar when we're thinking about opening those channels. Also, in the spaces that aren't insulated, as I mentioned before, this isn't something we've talked about a lot, but there are the neuron is leaky. We did talk about this a little bit with potassium, and in those insulated areas, the neuron isn't leaking, so the impulse gets carried along the entire length of that insulation without losing any of its intensity. Intensity is the right word. Without losing any of its ions would be the better way to say that. Okay, so this is called saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction. Okay, saltatory means jumping. Okay, jumping. And now we're going to pause for a second to watch a really cool video about saltating, jumping. Okay, so what you're looking at is my husband's Twitter page. And he, as I mentioned, he studied jumping spiders for his PhD. He still studies jumping spiders. And he was doing this test where he was trying to see if the various things he was testing, he studies nutrition, were influencing their ability to jump, because these guys are literally called jumping spiders. And this is just awesome and fun. Whoa. I think I can. Oh, just kidding. So these little spiders, these little jumping spiders, some people in the spider community refer to them, and I refer to them as little teeny 8-legged kittens. So when they were doing that crazy, awful jumping, it so reminded me of little kittens when they're trying to jump. And this is just a couple of images. They seriously are kind of like little spider kittens. Why am I telling you all this? Well, aside from the fact that it's cool, I'm telling you this because these jumping spiders, hopefully this will stick in your mind, these jumping spiders are called salticids, or salticidae. So because saltatory conduction is what it's, or saltation, I don't even know what the right word is for when spiders do it, is jumping. And these are jumping spiders. And so I'm hoping that this information will help you remember saltatory conduction. Why is it called saltatory conduction? Because the action potential hops from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. And this is much faster. This conduction is much faster than conduction in unmyelinated axons. There are axons in our body that are naturally unmyelinated. They're slower. They conduct impulses slower, and we'll talk about some of them a little bit later in the semester. Okay, so this can kind of be visualized with some nerve pathologies, and I have a kind of a cool visual that I'm going to use for this instead of just drawing, because I know my drawings are fantastic, but okay, so here we're looking at neurons, and the neuron on the left is myelinated, and the neuron on the right has experienced damage to its nerve. And now I took the time, and it's not even going to work because my PowerPoint is freaking out. It's very annoying. Okay, so what we're seeing is the neuron on the right, because of its scarred myelin, because of the damage that it's experienced. This is what happens in multiple sclerosis. That impulse, rather than traveling down the entire length of the neuron, some of it gets lost here. It leaks out of this damaged insulation. And so the impulse doesn't reach its destination, sometimes at all, or it doesn't reach its destination as we would expect it to reach its destination. And an interesting thing about this is that this is due to the immune system. And so the immune system is causing, in some way, this damage. It's attacking these cells. It's attacking these oligodendrocytes because we're in the central nervous system, which is crazy. But as crazy as that is, this is actually happens a lot. We talked about it already when we discussed the endocrine system. And now here we're in the nervous system, and the same thing is happening. So another syndrome, Guillain-Barré syndrome, this is when the antibodies attack the myelation in the peripheral nervous system. So with multiple sclerosis, we were in the central nervous system, and now we're in the peripheral nervous system where antibodies are coming and they're attacking that myelination and causing damage. And so the antibody injures the myelin membranes. And so if the antibodies are coming and they're attacking these myelin membranes, what must be going on? What must be going on between the antibodies and the membrane? So what's going on is that key in the lock thing has gone awry. These antibodies, the key, now matches a self-lock. It now matches the body. And so they're recognizing, for some reason, they're recognizing this body. They're recognizing self as foreign and attacking it. Okay, one last little note. There's various tests that doctors will do to check the integrity of the nervous system. One of the things that they'll do is called a Babinski's reflex. And this is showing you what that looks like. In a baby or very young child, what you'll see is when the doctor or the person doing the reflex test runs the instrument up their foot in a specific pattern, the toes flare, they separate and pull back. Whereas after 2 years of age, the toes flex forward instead. And what's happening is that the myelination of the peripheral nervous system is still happening up until the age of 2. So the neurons are still becoming fully myelinated up until the age of 2. And if a person has correct myelination after the age of 2, the normal response is for the toes to flex. If someone older than 2 has this toe spread pull back situation, it indicates that there's a problem with the myelination of their peripheral nervous system. Okay, next we dig into the central nervous system specifically.